Listen carefully. What you are about to hear was never meant for public knowledge. These are the kinds of records that were hidden, sealed away in private archives, and denied by every respectable historian who stumbled too close. Yet the story still whispers, through diary pages stained with frost, through ledgers locked away in crumbling town halls, through the blood memory of those who survived. It is the story of a man who should not have existed, who came out of the mountains in the winter of 1847 with a name he borrowed, a face that unsettled even the bravest of men, and a philosophy so dangerous that entire families would vanish in his shadow. His name was Samuel Hawthorne, but the truth, he was no man you would recognize, no origin you could map, no history you could verify. He belonged to something older, something hidden, something alien to the soil of this earth. That February, the mountains of Vermont had become a graveyard. 17 souls had already perished in the storms that season, frozen stiff in their cabins, lost in the endless white, buried beneath avalanches that swallowed homes whole. The survivors of Millbrook, a town so small it didn't even make most maps, were starving, coughing, losing faith by the hour. Their doctors' bottles were empty. Their hunters found no game. Their prayers echoed unanswered against the black sky. And then he arrived, stumbling out of a blizzard no human being could have survived. Upright, calm, as if the wind bent around him instead of through him. His coat shimmered with a sheen no farmer recognized. His boots left prints in geometric patterns in the snow, studded with metal-like stars arranged in constellations. And when the townsfolk saw him, they swore he was not lost. No, he was following a path only he could see, as if he had always known where they would be, waiting for him. The boy who first spotted him thought he was looking at a corpse. The men who gathered felt an unease in their bones, like prey sensing the approach of a predator. And yet, when the stranger stepped into the glow of lantern light, he smiled. He spoke with words smooth as polished stone. He carried a leather satchel at his side, bulging with bottles, powders, and tools no one recognized. And when he touched the sick, they recovered. When he whispered instructions, the fever broke. Within hours, Samuel Hawthorne transformed from an outsider into a savior. But saviors, as you will learn, often demand more than gratitude. They demand obedience. They demand faith. And Samuel Hawthorne demanded something far darker. Millbrook was not the kind of place where strangers appeared unnoticed. In fact, the town had not seen a new face in months. Winter locked the people in, sealing them from the world, and yet Samuel Hawthorne emerged from the storm as if he had been waiting for this precise moment, as if he had chosen this town to make his entrance. He stood 6 feet tall, lean but powerful, with a face that seemed carved from harsh stone. His cheekbones cut sharp under pale skin, his hair streaked prematurely with white, and his eyes, icy blue, almost colorless, stared through men as if weighing their worth. That stare unsettled even the strongest among them. Some swore later that he wasn't looking at them, but into them, memorizing their weaknesses, marking their fears. His story, when he finally spoke, was strange. He claimed to have wandered from beyond the peaks, from a land where the sun moved differently, where people lived by older laws that outsiders had forgotten. His voice was smooth, but his words carried an ancient weight, as if he spoke truths too old to be lies. The adults of Millbrook distrusted him instantly, though they couldn't say why. But the children, the children were captivated. They crowded around him, wide-eyed, hanging on his every word like he was a prophet. And that was the first sign of danger. Samuel Hawthorne did not win the strong. He captured the innocent first. That night, Abigail Foresque, who ran the town's inn, offered him shelter. She placed a mug of strong coffee in his hands, and as the fire cracked, the townsfolk gathered around to hear more. He did not beg for food. He did not plead for warmth. Instead, he offered them something: hope. When young Sarah Thornbury, coughing and pale, nearly collapsed beside the hearth, Hawthorne reached into his satchel. From it he pulled a vial filled with a dark, pine-scented liquid. 3 drops into warm water, he instructed, and within an hour her breathing eased. By dawn, her fever had broken. The news spread like wildfire. A miracle worker had come to Millbrook, a man who knew secrets no one else did. By the next day, half the town was lined outside the inn, desperate for cures. Some for pain, some for infections, some for the creeping shadow of consumption that had killed so many before. And Hawthorne, calm, patient, meticulous, treated them all, but there was something unnerving about his methods. His medicines worked, yes, but their smell was strange, their taste bitter, their effects almost too immediate. Dr. Ezekiel Putnam, Millbrook's Harvard-educated physician, was skeptical at first. Yet even he had to admit Hawthorne's cures worked where his own remedies failed. And in that admission, the balance of power shifted. For once the town trusted Hawthorne more than their doctor, it was only a matter of time before they trusted him more than their God. The second night after his arrival, Millbrook began to shift. The people who had once whispered of abandoning the valley now whispered about Samuel Hawthorne instead. Mothers who had been resigned to burying their children pressed tiny hands into his, begging for his medicines. Fathers who had cursed the endless snow now watched him walk into storms without hesitation, returning with herbs, roots, and most disturbingly, fresh meat when no other hunter had seen so much as a rabbit in weeks. That meat, it became the first true fracture in the town's trust. He called it venison, or hare, or wildfowl from the forests beyond. Yet the cuts were unfamiliar, the muscle fibers wrong. Hunters, men who had carved animals their entire lives, stared at the flesh and felt a quiet dread coil in their stomachs. They never said it aloud. Not then. But later, in journals and confessions written by lantern light, they admitted the truth. Some of those cuts looked like no animal they had ever known. They looked human. Dr. Putnam, already uneasy, studied Hawthorne closely. He noticed his peculiar habits. The man never slept more than a few hours at a time. He would rise in the blackest hours of night, sit by the window, and stare out across the white void of the valley with an intensity that unsettled even the strongest nerves. Sometimes he disappeared for hours into the blizzard, always returning with supplies impossible to find in such weather. When pressed, he would only smile and speak of the old ways of survival, the rhythms of the white wilderness. And still, his cures worked. A woman nearly lost to fever rose from her bed the morning after his treatments. A logger who had coughed blood for weeks walked the streets again, declaring Hawthorne a gift from Providence itself. Even Reverend Greenfield, the Yale-trained minister, struggled to keep his congregation steady. The pews were thin. The fire inside the church grew cold. For each time a villager prayed and saw no answer, they turned instead to the stranger who answered in hours. That is how it begins, not with fear but with gratitude. Not with rejection but with welcome. A dying community embraced him like salvation itself. But salvation always demands payment, and Samuel Hawthorne's payment would not be in coin or labor. His price would be far more intimate, final. By the fourth day, Millbrook no longer resembled the same community that had existed before Hawthorne's arrival. Where once men gathered at the general store to argue over supplies, now they gathered around him. Where once mothers sought Reverend Greenfield's prayers, now they whispered Hawthorne's instructions in their kitchens. The town, starving for hope, had bent toward him like starving dogs to a butcher's table. Yet the more they leaned on him, the more their fear grew. For his cures were not gentle, they carried with them consequences no one could explain. Those who drank his dark elixirs recovered swiftly, but their sleep was no longer their own. Dreams began to haunt the cured, visions of white fields stretching forever, of eyes watching from beneath the snow, of voices calling them to feast in places that felt older than the world itself. They awoke sweating, trembling, but healthier than before, torn between gratitude and unease. Dr. Putnam, the man of science, became obsessed with Hawthorne's medicines. He tried to replicate them, to analyze their ingredients, but what he discovered unsettled him more than ignorance. Beneath the bitter herbs he smelled something else, something faint but unmistakable. The sweet, coppery trace of blood, the kind he had only known in surgery, the kind no medicine should contain. Still Putnam said nothing. Not yet, for who was he, a failed doctor with debts and shame behind him, to accuse the one man keeping the town alive? He kept his suspicions locked in his journals, written by candlelight while the storm howled outside. And while he wrote, Hawthorne worked. He visited homes uninvited, observing family routines, asking quiet questions about lineage, about ancestry, about which families had roots deepest in the valley. His pale eyes did not simply look, they calculated. Children adored him most of all. They followed him, clung to him, begged for more stories of his people beyond the peaks. And he told them, spinning tales of old rituals of endurance in the cold of communities bound not by law but by sacrifice. Parents, uneasy yet grateful, allowed it. After all, their children were healthier now. Was it not worth a few strange stories to see their sons and daughters live? This is how control grows. It does not seize you in a single violent act. It creeps, it seduces, it whispers, and by the time you realize you have surrendered, it is already too late. Samuel Hawthorne was no guest in Millbrook. He was planting roots, and the ground itself was beginning to change beneath him. By the end of his first week in Millbrook, Samuel Hawthorne no longer moved like a stranger. He moved like a man who belonged, like someone who had always belonged. The townsfolk spoke his name more often than they spoke of God. His remedies had turned their grief into relief, their despair into gratitude. And with gratitude came loyalty. But not everyone bent so easily. Reverend Isaiah Greenfield, the minister who had once commanded the souls of Millbrook, saw his congregation dwindling. He noticed the empty pews, the fading hymns, the whispered excuses. People who had once begged the Lord for deliverance now knelt at Hawthorne's door, begging for bottles and powders instead. The Reverend confronted him one evening in the inn's common room, his voice sharp, his Bible clutched like a weapon. "The Lord alone heals," he thundered. "Your medicines are a temptation, a false salvation," and Hawthorne did not argue. He only smiled, and then, before all who gathered, he asked the Reverend a single question. "If your God heals, why does your flock still suffer?" The silence that followed was colder than the storm outside. Greenfield's face burned red with fury, but he had no answer, for even he had seen his own parishioners cured by Hawthorne's hand. His own prayers had gone unanswered, but Hawthorne's vials worked in hours. That night, whispers spread faster than the snowdrifts. Some said the Reverend's faith was weak. Others said perhaps God had sent Hawthorne himself as an angel, a messenger, a new covenant. And though Reverend Greenfield fought harder with each sermon, his voice no longer carried weight. He was losing his people one cured body at a time. Dr. Putnam fared little better. His medical skill, once a source of pride, was mocked by the miracle worker's success. Townsfolk began comparing him to Hawthorne openly, sneering at his dwindling supplies and ineffective remedies. He retreated into silence, scribbling longer and darker entries in his journals. He began to fear the stranger, not just as a rival, but as something inhuman. He noted the pale eyes that never seemed to blink, the way Hawthorne's breath never fogged in the cold, the way his body showed no weakness, no fatigue, no need for rest. And yet the people no longer cared about science, or sermons, or truth. They cared about results. Samuel Hawthorne delivered what neither doctor nor minister could: life. And in a town starving for survival, life was the only God that mattered. By the second week, Millbrook was no longer simply surviving. It was adapting to him. The townsfolk began to adopt Samuel Hawthorne's ways without realizing it. He had never demanded obedience outright. He had never raised his voice or spoken like a tyrant. Instead, he planted seeds, phrases, gestures, suggestions, that began to grow in their routines like hidden roots twisting beneath the snow. It started with food. Hawthorne insisted that meals should be shared communally, that no family should eat alone. At first it sounded noble, even charitable, in a time of famine, but he was always present at these gatherings. He directed the seating, portioned the meals, instructed which cuts were for children, which for adults. His voice turned supper into ceremony, and though no one dared question it, Dr. Putnam began to notice something disturbing. The freshest, reddest cuts of meat always passed through Hawthorne's own hands first. Then came the fires. He told them to burn their wood differently, in patterns, stacked in strange shapes, ignited in sequences that meant nothing to them, but seemed deeply symbolic to him. When asked why, he said only, "The fire remembers what you feed it." And though they laughed nervously, they obeyed. For when Hawthorne's fire burned, the rooms grew warmer than ever before. When his rituals guided the flame, the blizzards outside seemed to soften, if only for a moment. But it was the children who bore his influence most clearly. They mimicked his words, his strange accent that belonged to no nation. They sketched symbols in the snow with sticks, shapes that no one recognized yet filled their parents with dread. They began playing Hawthorne's games. Strange contests of endurance, silence, and secrecy. One game involved sitting motionless in the snow until Hawthorne himself decided who had passed the trial. Parents allowed it because their children, those who had been sickly before, seemed stronger than ever now. Reverend Greenfield watched in horror as the flock slipped further from him, but his warnings only made him sound desperate. Hawthorne never denied God. He never blasphemed. Instead, he would nod solemnly during sermons, then whisper afterward, "The Creator made the cold, the strong survive it, the weak do not. This is the oldest law." And men who had buried too many friends that winter found themselves agreeing. By then, it was no longer a question of faith versus heresy. It was a question of survival. And when survival speaks, morality becomes very quiet. The first sign came quietly, almost unnoticed. Ruth Carraway, a frail widow who had been bedridden for weeks, walked into the town square one morning with color in her cheeks and strength in her limbs. People rejoiced, praising Hawthorne's medicine. She lifted baskets, chopped wood, and sang like a girl half her age. But when night came, neighbors heard her pacing. The sound never stopped. From dusk until dawn, her footsteps dragged across the floorboards of her cabin, ceaseless, restless. After 3 nights, her son found her standing in the doorway, eyes glazed, whispering in a tongue he could not recognize. Others soon followed. Each cure carried a shadow. Children who had been fever-ridden now laughed too loudly in the dark, their voices shrill, their teeth chattering as though the cold no longer touched them. A farmer who had nearly died of infection recovered, only to grow unnaturally silent, watching his neighbors with a predator's patience, speaking only when Hawthorne addressed him directly. Dr. Putnam grew frantic, warning that these were not cures at all but transformations. He begged the townsfolk to stop drinking Hawthorne's concoctions, to return to medicine and prayer. Yet no one listened. Why should they? Illness no longer killed. Weakness no longer lingered. So what if the cured seemed altered? Was that not a fair price for life? But Reverend Greenfield saw it differently. He called a gathering in the chapel, demanding that the people renounce Hawthorne. He read passages of scripture with fire in his voice, thundering that the stranger was leading them into damnation. For a moment, it seemed as if the old authority might return. Faces turned uneasy, murmurs rose. Then Hawthorne entered the chapel. He said nothing at first. He simply walked to the front, standing in silence until even Greenfield's voice faltered. When he finally spoke, it was soft, gentle, almost mournful. "Would you rather bury your children in faith or see them live in strength?" The words broke the Reverend's hold like glass. Parents wept. Mothers clutched their sons and daughters. And though Greenfield cursed him, few stayed behind when Hawthorne left the chapel. The congregation followed their new shepherd into the snow. From that night onward, the church bells of Millbrook rang less often. But the sound of strange chanting, drifting from gatherings around Hawthorne's fire, carried farther and farther into the storm. By late January, Millbrook was no longer the same village. Snow buried the streets, yet no one seemed to notice the cold anymore. Children ran barefoot through the drifts, their skin flushed but unburned. Farmers worked bare-handed, splitting frozen logs as though their bodies had grown impervious to frost. What should have been a season of starvation and silence was instead filled with an unnatural vigor, a vitality that bordered on frenzy. But this vigor came with a hunger, not for bread or broth, but for something rawer, sharper. Families who had once rationed their meagre stores began slaughtering livestock in the dead of night, eating meat red and steaming before it ever touched a fire. The village dogs vanished, then the stray cats. And when Dr. Putnam questioned where the sudden abundance of food was coming from, people averted their eyes, muttering that Hawthorne had provided. The truth revealed itself one morning when a hunter stumbled back from the woods with eyes wide as frost-bitten glass. He claimed he had seen Ruth Carraway, the widow Hawthorne had cured, kneeling in the snow, her hands buried in the carcass of a deer, lifting handfuls of steaming entrails to her mouth with reverence. When confronted, she did not deny it. She only smiled, blood-staining her teeth, and whispered, "I am stronger now." The hunter tried to rouse the town, but many only shrugged. Was it so terrible, they reasoned, to take what the body demanded if it meant survival? They had been starving for months. And if Ruth looked healthier than she had in years, was that not proof that Hawthorne's way was true? Dr. Putnam, horrified, turned once more to his journals. He filled page after page with frantic observations, pallid skin that did not flush with exertion, eyes reflecting light like a predator's, breath that grew fainter the longer Hawthorne's medicine coursed through their veins. He described it not as healing but as a trade, the body restored, but at the cost of something unseen. Reverend Greenfield, meanwhile, tried to rally what few still trusted him. He preached of abomination, of unnatural rites, of demons cloaked as men. But the chapel stood emptier each night, its candles burning low, while across town, Hawthorne's fires roared bright. Around those fires, the villagers sat in circles, whispering chants in unison, words no one remembered learning, words they could not stop repeating. And always, at the center, stood Samuel Hawthorne, smiling softly, watching his flock grow stronger, hungrier, less human. It happened on a night when the snow fell thicker than ever before, choking the roads and sealing the town in white silence. The villagers had gathered, as they did now, around Hawthorne's great fire in the square. Its flames roared unnaturally high, fed not just with wood, but with bundles of strange herbs and powders he carried in his satchel. The firelight painted their faces with a fevered glow, their eyes reflecting the blaze like mirrors. Among them was Thomas Avery, a blacksmith who had resisted Hawthorne longer than most. He had not touched the man's medicines, nor bowed to his rituals. His wife, however, had begun to change, her hands trembling when she prayed, her gaze drifting toward Hawthorne with something like devotion. That night, Thomas snapped. He rose to his feet, voice booming above the chanting. "This is madness! You feed us poison! You turn our wives and children into beasts! I will not bow to you!" For a heartbeat silence. Then laughter, low, cruel, rolling through the crowd like thunder. It was not Hawthorne who answered, but Thomas's own wife. Her voice was soft, trembling with both sorrow and hunger. "You're already too weak, Thomas. You'll never survive the winter." Before he could speak again, she lunged. The crowd followed. Dozens of hands seized him, dragging him toward the fire. He screamed, cursed them as devils, but no one stopped. Not a soul. Even the children stood, watching with blank faces as their fathers and mothers tore at him with bare hands. Dr. Putnam arrived too late, bursting into the square just as the frenzy reached its peak. He froze at the sight, blood steaming against the snow, bodies crouched in animal posture, teeth flashing in firelight. And above them all, Samuel Hawthorne did not lift a finger. He simply watched, calm and still, as though this too were part of his design. When it was over, there was no body left to bury. Only bones, blackened by fire, cracked and split. The next morning, no one spoke of Thomas Avery again. His forge was silent, his home abandoned, and his name carried away on the wind as though he had never lived at all. But Reverend Greenfield did not forget. That night, alone in his chapel, he fell to his knees and prayed not for his congregation, but for deliverance from the man who had stolen them. He prayed until his voice gave out, until the candles guttered, until the darkness seemed to whisper back. And in that silence, he knew one truth with absolute certainty. Millbrook no longer belonged to God. Reverend Greenfield did not sleep after that night. He pored over scripture by candlelight, his fingers trembling as he searched for words strong enough to banish the evil that had taken root in Millbrook. But every passage he read sounded hollow against the memory of Avery's screams. The devil did not fear sermons. The devil feasted on them. At dawn, he rang the chapel bell with all his strength. Its cracked tone shuddered across the village, pulling a thin gathering of souls from their homes. A few still came. Old women who clutched rosaries, children too young to understand, and men who had not yet tasted Hawthorne's medicine. Their eyes were wide with fear, their bodies gaunt with hunger. They listened as the Reverend thundered, "You walk in the shadow of a wolf, not a shepherd. This man promises life, but delivers only damnation. Your neighbors vanish into his fire, your children chant words no holy tongue has spoken. Will you not see? Will you not rise?" But before the last echo faded, the chapel doors creaked open. Hawthorne entered, flanked by villagers whose faces glowed with a strange, feverish health. They moved with eerie grace, their eyes fixed on the Reverend as though waiting for his final breath. Hawthorne did not shout. He did not even step onto the altar. He simply stood among the pews, smiling faintly. "These people prayed," he said softly, his voice carrying with unnatural clarity. "They begged for salvation, and God gave them silence. I gave them strength. I gave them survival. And you?" He looked at Greenfield with pity, almost tenderness. "You offer them graves." A murmur rose among the flock. Some clutched their crosses tighter. Others lowered them, ashamed. Greenfield's voice faltered, his certainty buckling beneath the weight of Hawthorne's calm authority. He could see it in their eyes. The choice had already been made. In desperation, he reached for the heavy iron cross that stood upon the altar and raised it high. His voice broke with fury. "Then if you are no man of God, begone from his house!" For the first time, Hawthorne's smile dimmed. The air thickened. The candles sputtered though no wind touched them. A sound, a low, rumbling hum, rose from the villagers at his side, their throats vibrating in unison with a chant too old for human tongues. Greenfield's arm trembled, but he held the cross aloft, sweat pouring down his face. For a breathless instant, it seemed as if the darkness recoiled, as if the symbol still held power. Then Hawthorne stepped forward, his eyes glinting with something inhuman. The reverend strength gave out, the cross slipped from his hands and struck the stone floor with a hollow clang. The sound was louder than any sermon. It echoed through the chapel like a death knell. When Greenfield fell to his knees, his flock did not rush to lift him. They turned one by one and followed Hawthorne back into the snow. The reverend was left alone, sobbing at the altar, his faith in ruins. Jonathan Putnam had once been a man of reason. He believed in tinctures, poultices, and the careful balance of humours. Yet after weeks of witnessing the impossible, bodies healed without medicine, hunger replaced with frenzy, villagers chanting in tongues they had never studied, reason had begun to feel like a candle burning in a storm. Still, he clung to his craft. He began collecting samples in secret, scraps of cloth stained with blood from Hawthorne's patients, bits of bone left charred in the square after Avery's execution, even the herbs Hawthorne burned in his towering fires, which released a sickly sweet smoke that made the villagers' eyes shine. By lamplight, he studied them in his cellar. He boiled, crushed, distilled, and wrote until his fingers cramped. The bones disturbed him most. Human marrow should have been pale, brittle in winter's chill. Yet these were blackened through with a resinous substance that clung like pitch, as though something unnatural had seeped into the very skeleton. When heated, the marrow gave off fumes that made him dizzy, whispering fragments of voices in his ear. One night he nearly collapsed after inhaling too deeply. As he staggered upright, he realized with horror that his own hands were trembling in rhythm to a faint hum. The same hum he had heard in the chapel when Hawthorne's followers had chanted. That was when he resolved to find Hawthorne's source. He began shadowing the man at a distance, careful to keep to the snow-laden alleys. For several nights, he saw little, just the same rituals around the fire, the same quiet sermons whispered into eager ears. But then, on the night of the new moon, Hawthorne broke his pattern. Instead of the square, he walked into the woods carrying no lantern. The villagers did not follow. Alone, he moved with uncanny certainty, as though the darkness welcomed him. Dr. Putnam followed, his breath shallow, his boots muffled by fresh snow. For nearly an hour they wound deeper until the trees thinned, and the land dropped away into a hollow. At its center lay a circle of stones older than any settler's hand, half buried in frost and lichen. Within that ring Hawthorne knelt, spreading strange powders in the snow. Then he began to chant, not in English, not in Latin, but in a tongue that made Putnam's ears ache, a language that seemed to twist the very air. The ground trembled. From the cracks in the stone, black mist seeped upward, coiling like smoke, like tendrils searching for flesh. Putnam clutched his journal, his heart hammering. He knew then that Hawthorne was not a man of medicine. He was a vessel, channeling something far older, far hungrier, and Millbrook was already too deep in its grasp. Dr. Putnam stumbled back from the stone circle, his breath clouding in frantic bursts. The chanting still rang in his ears, rattling his skull like a fever dream. He wanted to run. God, he wanted to flee Millbrook that very instant, to abandon his instruments, his patience, his vows, and vanish into the frozen wilderness. But when he reached the edge of the woods, he froze. The village lights glowed faintly in the distance, and with them came the memory of faces. Children he had delivered into the world, neighbors he had bandaged, wives who had trusted him when fevers rose. If he fled, they would be left to Hawthorne entirely. If he stayed, he might be swallowed as Avery was. For 3 nights he did not sleep. He wrote furiously in his journals, recording every detail of what he had seen. The black mist, the chanting, the unholy marrow. He locked the notes inside a chest beneath the floorboards, as though even paper might betray him if left unattended. Finally, his mind turned to Reverend Greenfield. The man was broken, yes, but he was the only soul in Millbrook who still dared speak against Hawthorne. Putnam knew the Reverend's faith had faltered, yet perhaps that weakness was what made him human still. So, under cover of snow, he went to the chapel. He found Greenfield slumped at the altar, haggard and hollow-eyed, a Bible open before him though his lips did not move in prayer. "Reverend," Putnam whispered, his voice hoarse, "I've seen what he does when the village sleeps. He draws power from the stones, something older than this land itself. It is not medicine. It is not God. It is something else, and it feeds on us." Greenfield raised his gaze slowly. His eyes were rimmed with red, his cheeks streaked with salt. For a long while, he said nothing. Then he rasped, "Do you think I have not felt it? Each night I pray, and each night it answers, not God, but it. The thing in the dark. It laughs at me, Doctor. It laughs." The Reverend's voice cracked, and he gripped Putnam's arm with desperate strength. "If you have proof, we must burn it. Burn him. Drive it out before the spring thaws, or Millbrook will never see another season." For the first time, a spark of resolve lit in the Reverend's eyes. It was not hope, but fury, thin and fragile, yet alive. Putnam nodded, though his stomach twisted. He knew the truth fire would not be enough. He had seen the black mist rise from the stones, and he feared that even if Hawthorne's body perished, whatever dwelled beneath Millbrook would endure. Still, he said nothing. Because at that moment, he understood despair could not be their weapon. Only the illusion of a plan might keep them sane long enough to fight. And so, two broken men made a pact in the flickering candlelight to destroy Samuel Hawthorne, even if it meant damning themselves. The days that followed their pact were marked by whispers and shadows. Greenfield and Putnam spoke only in the chapel or beneath the doctor's cellar, their words hushed, their eyes darting toward every window as if the walls themselves had ears. They plotted as desperate men do, without certainty, without unity, clinging only to the thought that resistance, however futile, was better than silence. But Millbrook was no longer the same village. By midwinter, nearly every home bore Hawthorne's mark, a crude sigil carved above doorframes, a symbol of three intersecting lines that seemed to shimmer faintly in moonlight. Those who bore the mark spoke with a single voice, their smiles too wide, their health too vigorous for the hunger season. Even the sick rose from their beds with sudden vitality, though their eyes burned like coals beneath the skin. When Greenfield tried to summon his flock again, only two came, a boy no older than 12, and a widow whose hands shook as though palsied. Both begged him not to speak against Hawthorne aloud. "He hears," the widow whispered, clutching her shawl. "Even when he is not near, he hears." Meanwhile, Putnam's medical practice had grown eerily quiet. No one came for poultices or powders. No one sought his counsel. He realized with horror that the village no longer needed him. Hawthorne had taken his place, not just as healer, but as keeper of their very souls. The doctor's bitterness deepened when he discovered that some of his own patients, those he had nursed through fever, those whose infants he had delivered, now looked at him with suspicion. When he passed them in the square, they would pause, tilting their heads in perfect unison, as though weighing whether he was still one of them. Greenfield noticed the same. Parishioners who had once kissed his hand now crossed themselves when he drew near, muttering prayers not from scripture but in Hawthorne's strange tongue. And then the first betrayal came. One evening, as snow piled heavy against the chapel doors, Greenfield and Putnam bent over a hand-drawn map of the village, whispering of where they might strike first, whether to destroy Hawthorne's fire pit or to desecrate the stone circle in the woods. A knock sounded at the chapel door. Greenfield froze. Putnam's ink-stained fingers tightened on the map. Slowly, the Reverend opened the door. There stood the boy, the same child who had begged him for guidance days before. But now his face was slack, his eyes glassy, his mouth forming words in that unholy chant. And behind him loomed 3 villagers, their shadows long against the snow. "Samuel Hawthorne knows," the boy said in a voice not his own. "He knows." The villagers stepped forward. Putnam snatched the map from the table and thrust it into the fire, watching it curl into blackened ash. Greenfield seized the iron cross once more, though his hands shook violently. But the truth was undeniable. Hawthorne had already turned their own against them. Every whisper, every plan, every fragile hope, they had all been heard. The war for Millbrook had already begun. The villagers did not advance that night. They stood in the chapel doorway like statues, their faces lit by the fire where the map burned to ash. The boy's voice droned on, syllables of that awful language tumbling from lips too small to shape them. Then, abruptly, silence. And from the crowd, Samuel Hawthorne stepped forward. He was not cloaked in ritual robes nor crowned in smoke as he was at his gatherings. Tonight he wore only a dark wool coat, his hair dusted with snow, his face calm as a man strolling to supper. That serenity was what chilled Putnam most. The easy, neighborly smile upon a man who had already hollowed out the soul of an entire village. "Brothers," Hawthorne said softly, his voice echoing in the chapel rafters. "I had hoped you would join us willingly. You are needed, both of you. A doctor for the body, a reverend for the spirit. Together we could make Millbrook eternal." A Greenfield lifted the iron cross, though it rattled in his hands. "You are no shepherd," he hissed. "You are a wolf, and we will not bow." Hawthorne tilted his head, studying him with something that looked almost like pity. "Is that what you see? A wolf?" He stepped closer, and as he did, the candle flames in the chapel guttered low. "No, Reverend, I am the door. What lies beyond me is far greater than wolves and sheep. It is a mercy you cannot yet comprehend." Putnam, his heart hammering, forced himself to speak. "What do you want with us?" Hawthorne's eyes settled on him. They were dark, but within their depths shimmered pinpricks of light, like stars reflected in a bottomless well. "I want you to stop resisting," he said simply. "You waste your strength in fear, in fire, in sermons that no one hears. But the stones hear, the earth hears, and it has chosen Millbrook as its vessel. You may stand with me, or you may be consumed. There is no third road." The villagers behind him did not move. They waited in silence, as if their breath was bound to his command. For a moment, Putnam nearly faltered. He thought of the black marrow that had whispered in his cellar, of the hunger in the villagers' eyes, of the power that seemed to hum beneath Hawthorne's very skin. Could one man truly stand against this? Could two? Greenfield answered for them both. "We are not yours," the Reverend spat, lowering the iron cross as if ready to strike. Hawthorne's smile widened, sad, indulgent, inevitable. "Then you are theirs," he said. And at his word the villagers stepped into the chapel, their feet moving in perfect unison, their eyes alight with unnatural fire. The villagers surged forward like a tide. Their mouths did not scream, their faces did not twist with rage. They advanced with the calm inevitability of sleepwalkers, their eyes burning with that faint inner glow. Greenfield swung the iron cross, striking the first man across the temple. Bone cracked, and yet the villager did not fall. He only staggered, blood dripping down his cheek, then reached again with hands too steady, too sure. Putnam seized a candlestick from the altar and brought it down across the widow's arm. She did not cry out. Instead, her bones bent with a sickening crack, yet her other hand clamped tight around his wrist. Her grip was cold, far too strong for flesh. "God forgive me," the doctor gasped, wrenching himself free and shoving her into the fire pit where the remnants of the map still glowed. Her shawl caught flame. The chapel filled with the stench of burning wool and flesh. The boy moved next, stepping calmly through the smoke, his small hand raised, and the chant spilled once more from his lips. At the sound, the walls of the chapel groaned, timbers creaking as though the building itself wished to bow. "Silence him," Greenfield cried. Putnam lunged, his candlestick raised, yet he froze. For a heartbeat, he saw not the possessed child, but a patient he had delivered into the world 12 winters ago, still swaddled and screaming in his mother's arms. His hand trembled. The hesitation was nearly his undoing. The boy's voice grew louder, the rafters splitting, dust sifting from above. Then Greenfield acted. With a roar, he brought the iron cross down on the child's skull. The sound was sharp, final. The chant stopped. The chapel fell silent but for the crackle of flames. The remaining villagers halted, their heads turning in eerie unison toward Hawthorne, who still stood in the doorway. His expression had not changed. Calm, watchful, almost tender. "You see," Hawthorne said softly, stepping over the threshold, "even you are mine. You kill for me, though you name it resistance. The boy's blood stains your cross, Reverend. And your heart, Doctor, trembles with relief that you did not strike first. Already you are shaped." A Greenfield gasping, lifted the iron cross once more, though his arm shook under its weight. Better damned for fighting than damned for bowing. Hawthorne's smile widened. The flames on the widow's shawl leapt higher, though no oil nor wind fed them. They seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the rafters, painting the chapel in flickering shadows. "Then fight," Hawthorne whispered. "Fight until the stones themselves sing your names. You will find, gentlemen, that eternity is patient." And with that, he turned and walked into the night. The villagers followed, one by one, leaving the scorched chapel reeking of smoke and blood. Greenfield and Putnam collapsed against the altar, breath ragged, eyes wide with the knowledge of what they had done, and what it had cost them. Dawn seeped pale and cold through the cracked timbers of the chapel roof. The pews were scorched, ash drifted across the floorboards, and the boy's body lay still at the altar's base, his small face turned toward heaven. Neither Putnam nor Greenfield had slept. They sat slumped against the blackened wood, too weary to speak, yet unable to leave the corpse that bound them in silence. At last the Reverend rose, his joints creaking like old branches. He knelt beside the boy and closed his eyelids with trembling fingers. "I struck him down," Greenfield whispered. His voice was rough, unmoored. "A child. God have mercy. I struck a child." Putnam's hands shook as he wrung the suit from his coat. "You saved us both," he said, though the words fell hollow in the hushed chapel. "He was no longer a child. Yet his blood stains me," Greenfield murmured. He held up the iron cross, its edge blackened, flecked with drying crimson. "Hawthorne was right. I fight with his tools. And each time I grow nearer his likeness." The doctor said nothing. In truth, the thought gnawed at him too. The marrow samples in his cellar whispered, still in memory, their voices fainter but not gone. He had not destroyed them. He had not been able to. "We must go," Putnam said finally. "If we remain, the villagers will return, and next time he will not simply test us. He will claim us." Greenfield's eyes lifted, bloodshot and burning with conviction. "Then we do not flee, we strike first. If Hawthorne is the door, as he names himself, then doors may yet be closed." Putnam almost laughed, though it came out more like a cough. "And what will you use to close it, Reverend?" "Scripture, nails and wood. I tell you now, what moves through that man is not of flesh nor faith." Greenfield stood, his back straightening, his hand tightening on the cross. "Then we burn it out. The stones, the hollow, whatever root he draws from. We burn it until the soil itself remembers fire more than shadow." Putnam wanted to argue, to plead for flight, but the thought of leaving Millbrook sat like a stone in his chest. He imagined the whispers following him, the black marrow seeping into other towns, spreading like plague. No, if Hawthorne was not stopped here, he would not be stopped at all. He nodded grimly. "Then we end it." But as they stepped into the raw light of morning, the village seemed to breathe around them. Windows cracked open, pale faces peered with silent accusation, and doors shut again without a word. Millbrook was watching, and the doctor could not shake the feeling that, whatever plan they made, it had already been written into Hawthorne's design. They left the chapel behind as the village stirred awake. Smoke rose from chimneys, cattle were driven to pasture, and yet no villager spoke a word to them. Faces turned, eyes followed, but lips remained shut. It was as if the whole of Millbrook conspired in silence, waiting for something neither man could name. Greenfield carried the iron cross as though it were his own spine, shoulders set with grim determination. Putnam followed with a lantern, though the morning sun already cut across the fields. Both men knew daylight would not protect them in the place they now sought. The hollow lay beyond the orchard, where the earth dipped into a bowl choked with bramble and moss. The air grew heavier as they descended, the smell of wet stone mingling with something sharper, metallic, like blood rusted on iron. At the center of the hollow rose the stones. They were taller than men, worn by centuries, black with lichen. They formed a ring, and within that circle the earth was bare, no grass, no roots, only raw soil that seemed to breathe. Every few seconds, the ground shifted as though stirred from beneath. Putnam halted at the edge, his throat tight. "This is no altar of men." Greenfield raised the cross, his voice low but steady. "These are the teeth of the earth, and Hawthorne speaks with their tongue." The doctor knelt, brushing away the loose dirt between two stones. Beneath the topsoil, he saw veins of something pale, fibrous, like roots, yet pulsing faintly with rhythm. He recoiled, his hands slick with a black moisture that smelled of marrow. "They live," he whispered. "The stones live." A sound drifted across the hollow then. Not wind, not bird, but a low hum. The stones themselves shivered, and between them, faint motes of light rose like fireflies, spiraling upward before vanishing into the cold morning air. Greenfield clutched the cross tighter. This is where it must end. Here or nowhere. But before Putnam could answer, a voice carried down into the hollow. Calm, familiar, inevitable. "Then you have come at last." They turned. At the rim of the hollow, framed against the sky, stood Samuel Hawthorne. His coat stirred faintly, though no breeze touched the trees. Behind him, the villagers gathered in perfect silence, their eyes fixed upon the circle below. Hawthorne spread his hands, as though welcoming old friends. "The stones have been waiting for you." The ring of villagers parted as Hawthorne descended into the hollow. His boots touched the bare soil, and the earth rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. The motes of light swirled higher, spiraling above him in delicate patterns that no wind could explain. Greenfield raised the iron cross, its weight trembling in his grip. "This ends here, Hawthorne. Whatever covenant binds you to this place, we will tear it out root and stem." The Hawthorne smiled, but it was not mockery. It was something closer to pity. "You still think me a man, Reverend? You still think me separate from the stones, from the marrow of the soil? I am no guest here. I am the host." At his words, the villagers knelt in unison at the rim of the hollow, their hands clasped, their heads bowed toward the circle. A low chant began, not forced, not frenzied, but calm and steady, the murmur of prayer. The stones vibrated in answer. Their surfaces glistened with veins of black moisture, the same that had stained Putnam's hands. The ground between them pulsed now with visible rhythm, as though some vast heart beat beneath the earth. Putnam staggered, lantern shaking. "This is no superstition. The marrow, it grows. The whole village feeds it." The Hawthorne's gaze fixed on him, serene and unwavering. "You above all should understand, Doctor. You have studied it. You have heard it whisper. Does it not speak of promise? Of endless renewal? The body fails, but the marrow endures." Putnam's throat tightened. He thought of the jars in his cellar, the samples that refused to die, that pulsed still when flesh around them rotted. He had not told Greenfield of the voices, nor of the dreams. Greenfield stepped forward, his voice cracking with defiance. "Renewal through blood is no renewal at all. It is corruption, mockery of God's order." At this, Hawthorne lifted one hand, and the chant ceased. The villagers looked up, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim. "You invoke God's order," Hawthorne said, his tone still gentle, "yet you kill children and burn widows, thinking it deliverance. Which of us serves corruption? Which of us bows already?" A Greenfield's face twisted, but before he could reply, the earth split within the circle. Soil fell inward as if into a throat, revealing a pit lined with black, fibrous roots that writhed and twisted. The smell was overpowering, iron and rot, marrow and smoke. From within rose a sound, wet, cavernous, like breath drawn through 100 unseen mouths. The stones leaned inward, shuddering with resonance, as if bowing toward what lay beneath. Hawthorne extended his hand toward them both. "Step forward. The soil remembers you already. Why resist the inevitable?" Putnam's legs shook, his breath ragged. Somewhere deep within, he felt the pull. The same voice that had whispered to him in the cellar, promising knowledge beyond mortality, beyond decay. And for the first time, Greenfield saw doubt flicker in the doctor's eyes. The hollow thrummed like a living drum, each pulse of the pit sinking into Putnam's bones. His lantern quivered in his hand until it nearly slipped. For a heartbeat, he imagined dropping it into the black roots below, fire-consuming marrow, light-searing shadow. But then the voices came, not in sound, but in sensation, a warmth that spread through his skull, a weightless clarity that felt like truth. They whispered not of death, but of continuance. "Your body will fail, Doctor. Your hands will tremble, your eyes dim, but the marrow." The thought pressed against his mind like a tender palm. "The marrow endures, and through it, so will you." He swayed forward, the hollow air filling his lungs with sweetness, his doubts dissolving like mist. For the first time since Millbrook, he did not feel fear, only release. "Putnam," Greenfield's voice cracked like a whip. The Reverend seized his arm, yanking him back from the pit's edge. His eyes burned not with fear, but with raw anguish. "Do not listen! It is poison. Poison clothed as promise. The doctor looked at him, and for a moment his face was unrecognizable even to himself. His lips moved, voice fragile as paper. What if he speaks true, Reverend? What if this marrow, is God's secret placed in the earth? Not corruption but gift. A Hawthorne smile widened with quiet triumph. He did not command, did not shout. He merely extended both hands, palms open, a teacher awaiting his pupil. At last, you begin to hear, not with ears, but with marrow. Step forward, Putnam. Step into what was always yours. The villagers murmured in assent, 1,000 voices folding into one. The stones glowed faintly with veins of black fire, pulsing faster now, as though the pit itself craved his answer. Greenfield gripped the iron cross until his knuckles split. Blood streaked down the metal, but he did not let go. "Do not damn yourself, Henry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Better to die in the light than live forever in darkness." The doctor's breath caught. He looked to the pit, then to the Reverend. Between promise and faith, between endless life and the brittle mercy of mortality, his choice hovered in the silence, and the hollow seemed to hold its breath. The hollow shuddered as if straining beneath the weight of expectation. The villagers leaned forward on their knees, eyes fixed on Putnam, their breaths rising in unison. The pit gaped wider, roots thrashing like veins of some vast, unseen heart. Putnam's chest heaved. His mind swam with the marrow's whispers. Endless life, endless knowing, the promise of becoming more than man. Yet Greenfield's voice rang in him like iron striking iron, rough and painful but real. "You are not a vessel, Henry. You are a man. Flesh fails, yes, but it is in failing that we are made whole. Do not surrender what God made for the hollow's counterfeit eternity." Hawthorne's eyes glowed faintly in the firefly light. "He fears you, Doctor. He fears what you might become. The marrow does not lie. It never has. You have seen its truth in your jars, your studies. Why cling to dust when the earth offers bone everlasting?" The doctor's hand shook. The lantern swung over the pit, spilling trembling beams across the writhing roots. The hollow's breath rose up, thick and wet, filling his lungs until he nearly gagged. Then, clarity struck, not from the marrow, not from Hawthorne, but from within. He remembered his wife's grave, the soil he had touched with trembling fingers, the truth he had whispered to himself: all flesh must return to the dust. To live forever was not mercy, it was hunger without end. With a cry that tore his throat raw, Putnam swung the lantern down into the pit. Flame shattered glass, oil caught. The roots shrieked like living things, writhing in agony as fire raced along their black veins. The ground convulsed, stones buckling, motes of light scattering into sparks. The villagers screamed, some fleeing, others clawing at their faces as if blinded. The chant broke into chaos. Hawthorne staggered, his calm dissolving at last. His voice thundered over the hollow.
"Fool, you burn only flesh. Marrow cannot die."
But Greenfield surged forward, driving the iron cross into the soil where the roots convulsed. The metal hissed on contact, and a blinding light split the hollow, as if heaven itself had cracked the earth open. Hawthorne screamed, not in rage but in terror. His form split like smoke in a gale, pulled downward into the pit as the roots shriveled and collapsed. The fire consumed all, swallowing stone, soil, and shadow alike. Putnam shielded his face from the blast, but he did not run, neither did Greenfield. Both men stood as the hollow imploded, the pit sealing upon itself with a roar like thunder buried in the ground. And then, silence. The villagers were gone, the stones toppled and blackened. The hollow lay still, nothing left but scorched earth and the acrid stench of marrow burned away. Greenfield dropped the cross, his chest heaving. He turned to Putnam, his eyes rimmed red with smoke and grief. "It is finished." The doctor's voice was barely a whisper, or only buried.